Our opening text I want to start off with is from Hebrews 13 and verses 5. Let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as you have, for he hath said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. The whole world has recently been mourning the death of a queen who seemed to be much loved. Queen Elizabeth has passed away, and many people, even from our own denomination, have been mourning her death, her passing away. This is someone that very few people in the world have ever met personally. We all know about her, but we don't know her personally. Sometimes it seems to me that the King of Kings who died on Calvary, whom we all should have a personal relationship with, sometimes that death leaves us cold, numb, and it doesn't seem to always touch us as much as maybe this death of Queen Elizabeth has touched the whole world. And that's a sad situation. But that is how things are. The love of many will grow cold, is what the word tells us. These days, the days that we are living in, we are no longer safe. And it's getting worse every day. Difficulties are all around us. Our whole land is in trouble. And in fact, the whole world, the entire world, has got trouble that this world is not used to having. The shock of the recent COVID is still with us. And the next deadly disease that we are all looking forward to with dread could be just around the corner. We don't know. But nowhere is safe. And under such circumstances as these, it's easy to think or to feel that we have been forgotten. That we are left to ourselves. We are on our own. And often God feels very far away. So today I just want to look at some experiences that cause people to feel alone and forsaken. And in the times that we have ahead of us, difficult times, we know that, we are going to need a faith like never before. Because soon feelings will no longer be enough. And only God's promises will be all that we have to cling to. The young girl had just been raped. And she ran. She ran blindly, uncaringly, with tears streaming down her face, uncomprehendingly, as her mind tried to deal with the horror of what had just happened. It was a beautiful day, and her mother had sent her on an errand to deliver some fresh bread to a sick aunt who lived not very far away. And as she passed close by the temple on her way back home, she was summoned by her uncle, Uncle Simon, a man of God, a Pharisee, a priest. Willingly she had went to him, and then she had followed him into a room right next to the temple, where it had all happened. Suddenly she was in his grasp. She was unable to break free, and uncomprehendingly, she wondered, where was God? And while this awful deed was being carried out by someone that she knew, by a person that she had known her whole life, by a person that she had trusted. And afterwards, Uncle Simon had warned her not to tell anyone, because if she did, the temple and its significance would no longer be for her. She would no longer be able to come for learning, for wisdom, and no longer be able to come for the cleaning rituals from sin. But where was God anyway, she wondered. And in the coming months, this incident was repeated. Uncle Simon yielded tremendous religious power over her, because that was the way that she was brought up, and she couldn't escape. Where was God in all of this? Was he not a loving, a kind God, a good God, a delivering God? But the abuse continued, and always with a stern admonition to tell no one. And this ate at her soul. Like a cancer, it ate at her until this young girl could take it no longer. Mary of Bethany that was right close up to Jerusalem, just up and left. She just went away. She left Bethany where she was brought up. And she left with a broken spirit and with a broken spiritual life. Unable to believe in a God anymore. Unable to believe in a God that it would allow such things to happen. And so she just kept going down. She went down until she came to a little village called Magdala, a town where she knew no one, and no one knew her. And here she felt she would try again. She would try to make a new start. She would try to begin her life over again. And at first she tried very hard. She tried all sorts of menial jobs. But she succeeded at none of them. And then she fell prey to what had already happened to her in the past. It all happened over again. And her previous life experience now became her reality. And she became a prostitute. She was young, she was pretty, and men came looking for her. In fact, they came in droves. And Mary survived. In fact, she thrived, at least money-wise. And here she became known as Mary of Magdala or Mary the prostitute. A destitute family were without food. The husband had lost his job. There was nothing to feed the children. And the husband was sitting at the kitchen table with his head in his hands. Eventually he looked at his wife and he said, "You will have to take out your fishnet stockings. I don't know what to do. This is all we can do. The baby needs milk." And so the wife went, coming back at 6 o'clock in the morning with 26 Rand 50, which he placed in front of her husband, who was still sitting at the kitchen table. Looking at the money, he asked, "Who pays 50 cents for you?" To which he answered softly, "All of them." And hardened after a few years of this horrendous life, though Mary had vowed never to seek after God again, Mary was nevertheless touched by a girl that was her only friend, a friend that was in the same position as she was in. And her friend's description of an event that had occurred to her made Mary gasp, and she wondered if it could possibly be true. Her friend told her about a man that she had met, a man who did not look at her with disgust, a man who actually touched her head, blessing her, a man who loved her just as she was, a man whose kind words so filled her heart that she longed for a better, a new life. And Mary was stunned. Could there really be someone like that? Someone who cared, someone good? And Mary's mind was made up. She would go and she would find this man. And she would go and see if these things that had been told her were really true. I'm sorry, I've got a very dry mouth. I've got a bad cold, so just excuse me. And she would go looking for someone that would maybe accept her. And not long after this, she had her opportunity. Magdala was right next to the Sea of Galilee, and Jesus was coming to preach and to teach near her. And she went. There she met Jesus, and she discovered that her friend wasn't nearly as right as she could have been, because Jesus was more than her friend had told her. There she met the Master, and he prayed for her. He spoke words like she had never heard before, and in fact, he cast demons out of Mary. He cast demons from her tormented soul. Nothing in her past, nothing she had ever done, turned him away from her. He accepted her unconditionally, and she knew with a certainty that she was loved, that she was accepted forever. And slowly but surely, her own love and need for the Master grew. Although it took Jesus a further 6 times to cast the demons out of Mary, eventually Mary was set free, and she was totally free at last. She returned to Bethany. She returned to live with her brother and sister. And this family was a family that Jesus loved to visit. And he visited there in their home often. Often he visited with them. One day Mary heard or overheard Jesus telling his disciples that he was going to be killed. And Mary knew that she would have to do something for Jesus before this happened. And so she went to a scent merchant, and she demanded from him the very best that he had. The scent merchant looked her over, and he brought some really expensive scents that he thought Mary might be able to afford. But no, that wasn't good enough. It had to be something better. Each time she asked for something better, until the spice merchant became so exasperated that he went in to the back and he came out with the most expensive fragrance that he had. It was a small alabaster jar of nard that is only obtainable very high up in the Himalayas. And this is a spice that was fit only for kings, only for royalty. But to this merchant's great surprise, Mary was prepared to pay this huge sum that this little alabaster jar cost. You see, Mary had made some good money in her former life. Her former life of sin. And she spent all of this on this one gift. A gift of love. She kept it for him. She kept it for Jesus, not knowing when it would be an appropriate time for her to give it to him. One day, as Mary was walking back from the market in Jerusalem, back to Bethany, she heard a terrible cry of someone unclean. Unclean, unclean, the cry went up. The cry of someone that was struck by the very hand of God. A man doomed forever to live separated from his loved ones and separated from God's people. And with shock, Mary realized that this man was her Uncle Simon, the man who had led her into sin. Horrified by his appearance, Mary turned away and hurried home. But Jesus passed that way not long after, and Jesus did not turn away. He touched the rotting flesh, and he made Simon the Pharisee clean once again. Clean from sin and clean from this terrible leprosy that represented sin. And Simon the Pharisee was healed, and he was restored once again as a temple priest. And for what Jesus had done for Simon, Simon was not ungrateful. And as a special thank you to Jesus, whom he now thought of as a mighty healer, and also because Jesus had just recently raised up Lazarus, both Jesus and Lazarus were invited as special guests to a feast that Simon had prepared. He had prepared in their honor. 6 days before Jesus was crucified on Calvary, this feast was held. And Martha was also invited. She was in fact invited to cater for this event. But Mary's name is left off the guest list. And yet Mary sneaks in, completely unnoticed, until the little alabaster box is broken open. And then the smell, the sweet smell of salvation, could no longer be hidden. And everybody knows that Mary is there. Everybody notices the sinner. This sinner, yet Jesus sees a saint. And there is Mary, the sinner, using the gains that she had made by ill repute, the gains that she had made from prostitution, to shower her love onto her master. A gift that Jesus received gratefully. A gift that he received because it was from the bottom of her heart. And even today, that's all we have to offer him. Our sinful, our tainted lives, our lives of ill repute. But that's all that he wants. And he can, and he will, and he must change our lives if we come to him just as we are. And even here, in this situation, Jesus does not expose the sinful Simon and what he had done. His disgraceful conduct towards this young girl, or this young woman now. A woman that Simon looks down on as a great sinner, as she is here bowed down before Jesus, worshipping Jesus with everything that she has. And this is a woman that Simon only has disdain and disgust for. Now, Martha often invited Jesus into their home. But Mary invited Jesus into her heart. And yet, even after all this attention that they both got, his loving care for these two sisters, his salvation so full and free, time and time Jesus had shown their love, his love for them, that he was always there for them. And yet, both Mary and Martha insinuate that Jesus did not care for them, that he had forgotten them, and that he was not there for them when they needed him, that he was oblivious to their trials. Can't you see Jesus? Martha fumes. I am slaving, I am tired. Can't you see that I need help? I'm preparing all this for you and for your ragged bunch of disciples. And yet Jesus wanted more from her. He wanted much more. And the food that was appreciated was nice, but Jesus wanted Martha's heart as well. And Mary, she also accused Jesus. She accused Jesus of deserting them, even after all the times that Jesus had come to save her, to set Mary free. Yet when Lazarus fell sick, and I and Vern didn't discuss beforehand, I thought he was going to take my whole sermon. Lazarus was sick, and they sent this urgent message to Jesus, a message that they felt that Jesus, as their close family friend, would respond to immediately. "If you were here," Mary cried, "if you cared, my brother would be alive today. But now you have let us down. My brother is dead." What a human feeling. And if we were honest with ourselves, we would have to admit that this feeling has probably crossed our own minds quite often. Where were you, Lord, when I needed you? Have you felt this way before? Maybe you have wondered about God. Maybe you have wondered if He actually cares for you. It was 8 o'clock on a June morning in 1853 when a carriage drew up in front of James and Ellen White's home. They had hired this man to take them to Virginia's in Michigan, and now this man was waiting outside for them. So Mrs. White went to the door and called out to him, "Will we need to pack a lunch? It's 8 o'clock now. Will we be there before lunch?" "Oh, it's only 15 miles. That's about 24 kilometers, the man replied. "And we're going to have an early start, so we should be there before lunchtime." And so the driver helped the passengers into the carriage, and they started on their way. They followed the double-wheel tracks that ran through the forest. And in places, someone had laid logs over the worst holes. And this driver assured the Whites that he had travelled this way several times and that he was certain about the road. There were no signposts to mark the way, and all the double-wheel tracks that crossed their tracks looked alike, and Mrs. White wondered where they could be. But on and on they travelled. The June sun grew hot, and James White eventually asked the man, "Are we almost there?" The man pushed his hat off his head. His sweating brow at that stage, it was very hot, and he said, "Brother White, I'll have to admit that this trail doesn't look familiar. I must have taken a wrong turn somewhere, but never mind, we'll cut right back through the forest and back onto the trail." And so they went on through the forest, between the logs and the fallen trees, where Mrs. White could see no trace of a road. Mrs. White felt thirsty, but all the water around them seemed to be murky marsh water. And so she asked the driver, "Do you suppose that we could get some milk from some of these cows around here?" She pointed at some cows that were grazing nearby. And so the driver stops the carriage, takes a tin cup, and he starts stalking the nearest cow. The cow had ideas of its own and just moved away. And after this process was repeated 3 times, Mrs. White just said, "Never mind, I'll just stay thirsty." After a while, the travellers saw a small clearing, and in the middle of it was a log cabin. And as they drew close to the cabin, and then they clambered down from the carriage, a woman came out to meet them with a warm and hearty welcome. Evidently, this woman received very few visitors in this area. But she set out food and drink for them, And while these travelers, tired and thirsty, ate the food and drank the milk, they also talked. And after the woman learned that they were going to conduct meetings, she asked them, "Won't you please come and hold meetings in our neighborhood? It doesn't look like it, but quite a number of people live in this area. And if you come and preach at the local school, you'd be surprised at how many people would actually attend." She said, "The spiritualists are very active around here. I've been to some of their meetings and I'm afraid of them. Please come and give us some good preaching." She continued to beg earnestly, and then this lady began to weep. The Whites tried to comfort her. Mrs. White thought of all their pressing appointments and how urgent they all were. They couldn't promise to come at any time in the near future. She had to explain to the woman. But she said, "I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll leave you one of my books and some papers." And so the woman dried her tears, accepted the book and the periodicals, and told them how to find their way to Virgine's. And then they departed, new friends, hoping to see each other soon. The carriage drove on for several hours more. This journey, which should have only been 15 miles or 24 kilometers, bumped along for 40 miles, which is about 64 kilometers. But at last they reached Virgine's, and Mrs. White said to her husband, "Why? Why did this have to happen to us? The Lord knows how precious our time is. Why this long wandering through the forest?" And James White patted her hand and said in a comforting voice, "Always remember that He plans our lives, and someday we'll know why this strange experience was allowed to happen to us." It was 22 years later at the Michigan campground that a lady hurried up to Mrs. White. She shook her hand, greeted her joyously, and asked, "Do you remember being lost in the woods many years ago? Do you remember the log house in the clearing? You were lost and tired, hungry and thirsty, and while your horses rested, I gave you food and drink. You astonished me because you didn't waste any time gossiping or complaining about the trip. You just talked about Jesus and the beauties of heaven, and you gave me a little book, Experience and Views, a little book that you had written. Well, I read it over and over, and I still have it. It's about worn out now. I lent it to the neighbors, and they read it. And since then, Seventh-day Adventist ministers have come to our area. But you were the one that planted the seeds of truth. And so, we have quite a company of Sabbath keepers in our area. And then the woman threw her arms around Mrs. White in exuberant joy. "Oh, I'm so glad that we are Seventh-day Adventists." The woman stopped long enough to take a deep breath. Her face beamed, and she didn't need to tell Mrs. White of her joy in the Lord. Everything about her proclaimed it. And Ellen White's heart thrilled with joy too, because at last she had the answer to the question she had asked 22 years ago when they took that long and troublesome detour through the forest that day in June of 1853. In fact, they were on God's errand. He had sent them to this woman who longed for truth. He had sent them to bring the little book and to speak the words of courage and truth that set this lady's feet on the way to heaven. Why did this have to happen to us? The Lord knows how precious our time is. Why this long wandering through the forest? And these were the questions that the servant of God had asked. And later Mrs. White also wrote this: God never leads his children otherwise than they would choose to be led if they could see the end from the beginning and discern the glory of the purpose which they are fulfilling as co-workers with him. And the answer to her questions came 22 years later, after she had wondered, why, Lord? Why? Where are you? We're doing your work. Can't you see that? Can't you see it's for you? Romans 8 verses 28 says, and we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. Mary, Martha, Job, Sister White, you and me and many others have wondered, where is God? Where is he in this situation? We have all questioned his care for us. In fact, Job said, if only I could find you, I would tell you that I am right, but I can't even find you. In Job 23 verse 8 it says, behold, I go forward, but he is not there, and backward, but I cannot perceive him. But one day, we too, after often wondering about God, we too will look back at the times that we were apparently forsaken, apparently forgotten, and see that in fact God has been leading us all the way. A last story. Art and Sandy were two friends that had met at Columbia University. They immediately bonded over their shared passion for literature and for music. Art and Sandy became roommates, and they also became best friends. And with the idealism of youth, they promised to be there for each other no matter what. Not long after starting this college together, Sandy was struck by a tragedy. His vision became blurry, and although the doctors diagnosed it as temporary conjunctivitis, the problem just grew worse. Finally, after seeing a specialist, Sandy received the devastating news that severe glaucoma was destroying his optic nerves. This young man, who had such a bright future, would soon be completely blind. And Sandy was devastated. He fell into a very deep depression. He gave up his dream of becoming a lawyer and moved to Buffalo, where he worried about becoming a burden to his financially struggling family. And there, consumed with shame and fear, Sandy cut off all contact with all his old friends. He refused to answer letters or phone calls. But one day, suddenly out of the blue, to Sandy's shock, his buddy Art showed up at his front door. He was not going to allow his best friend to give up on life. And so Art had bought a ticket. He'd flown up to Buffalo unannounced. And Art convinced Sandy to give college another go. And he promised also that he would be right by his side throughout, to make sure that Sandy didn't fall. And that is literally or figuratively. And Art kept his promise, faithfully escorting Sandy around campus and effectively serving as his eyes. It was important to Art that even though Sandy had been plunged into a world of darkness, he should never feel alone. And Art actually started calling himself Darkness. He did this to demonstrate his empathy to his friend. And so he would say things like, "Darkness is going to reach you now." And so Art organized his whole life around helping Sandy. One day, Art was guiding Sandy through the crowded Grand Central Station when suddenly he said to Sandy, "I have to go." And he left his friend standing there alone and petrified. Sandy stumbled, he bumped into people, and he fell. He cut a great gash into his shin. But after a couple of hellish hours, Sandy finally got on the right subway train, and after exiting the station at 116th Street, Sandy bumped into someone who quickly apologized, and Sandy immediately recognized Art's voice. It turned out that his trusty friend had followed him the whole way home, making sure that he was safe, and giving him the priceless gift of independence. Sandy later said, "That moment was the spark that caused me to live a completely different life. Without fear, without doubt. And for that, I am tremendously grateful to my friend." Sandy graduated from Columbia, and then he earned a graduate degree at Harvard and at Oxford. He married his high school sweetheart and became an extremely successful entrepreneur and philanthropist. While at Oxford, Sandy got a call from Art. This time, it was Art who needed help. Art had formed a band with his high school friend Paul Simon, and they desperately needed $400 to record their first album. Sandy and his wife Sue had literally $404 in their bank account. But without hesitation, Sandy gave his old friend what he needed. Art and Paul's first album was not a success. But one of their songs, "The Sound of Silence," became a #1 hit a year later. And the opening line of this song echoes the way that blind Sandy always greeted his friend Art. "Hello, darkness, my old friend." Simon and Garfunkel went on to become one of the most beloved musical acts in history. Both these Columbia graduates, each of whom had added so much to the world in their own ways, are still best friends. Art Garfunkel said that when he became friends with Sandy, my real life emerged. I became a better guy in my own eyes and began to see who I was, somebody who gives to a friend. And Sandy describes himself as the luckiest man in the world. And it's in the darkness, in the troublesome dark times, that we too will have to start leaning on our best friend, Jesus. Ellen White was asked by someone about leaning on God, and she said, lean hard. And we really need to remember that God never leads his children otherwise, if they knew the end from the beginning. And in fact, that they are filling the purpose as co-workers with him. Now, Jesus also went through a Garden of Gethsemane experience. He also felt alone his disciples had deserted him, and he felt his Father's withdrawal from him. For the very first time in all eternity, Jesus and his Father were no longer one, because sin had separated them. Also on the cross, Jesus cried out, my God, why? Why have you forsaken me?" And we too are going to have our Gethsemane experiences. We too will be following in Jesus' footsteps. And now in the time of the end, we too are going to often feel abandoned, forsaken. Where is God is going to be our constant cry. Isaiah 26 verses 20 says this, "Go, my people, enter your rooms and shut the door behind you. Hide yourselves for a little while until his wrath is past. And it is then that the patience of the saints will be rewarded," just as with Jesus. God's presence is for a short period not felt, but he is still there because that was his promise. "I will never leave you nor forsake you." But just to show you how difficult it is to sometimes not feel deserted, Jesus' very own disciples were together with him in a boat. They wake up Jesus saying to him, "Don't you care that we perish?" Can you imagine that? With Jesus in the vessel, you can smile at the storm. Smile. That's what the song says, but these disciples weren't smiling. And in fact, the only reason why they stayed in that vessel is because they couldn't run on water. But the moment that that boat reached land, they ran. Chased by a demoniac. And after running a few kilometers, they glanced back and Jesus was still standing there, completely unafraid. But there will be another group of people when Jesus comes, a group of people that will be wondering why God had forsaken them, why he hadn't seen them, and where is he? This group of people will cry out to God, "Did we not prophesy in your name? Didn't you see that? Didn't you see the demons that we cast out in your name?" How could you forget that? "And have you also missed all the wonderful miracles that we have performed? Where were you, Lord? Where? Did you not see it?" But that's the thing. God doesn't notice us or our works. There's nothing we can do. And all that he accepts is what he has done. That's all he notices. But the ones through whom he has worked and done all these things, they know that they have done nothing. "When did we see you naked or in prison? When were you hungry or neglected? We did nothing. You sent us there. You were there. You saw it all. You did it all. We are only blind and naked and wretched. In fact, we are Laodicea. And you warned us about this condition. You told us to buy, and we bought. We bought without money, and you did all the work. We did nothing. It's all you're doing, and only you." And so when God feels furthest, in fact, he is nearest. And by faith, these saints worked, often not feeling God's presence with them, often wondering why he was so distant, leaving them to apparently work all alone. Have you felt that way? Have you felt God forsaken and alone? Then I want to tell you, you are in good company. And your faith will be rewarded, because soon you will see and be seen for all eternity, face to face, knowing as we are known. Amen.